Here we go. We are live. Welcome to KZN Top Business Masterclass, the first one in the series. I'd like to welcome our panel, David, Clifford, and Cathie. Welcome, everybody.
Morning.
The whole concept of the KZN Masterclass was a concept that was basically thought of between David and myself over a long period of time. And it's sort of like one of those things where we needed to address. In business, we have people who are specialists in what they do, and people just love to listen to what they do. And us being in the publishing game and the media, and I come across a lot of people who know a lot of things, and they keep all of these things so close to their chest that nobody gets to know what they really need to know. So if you go to our website now, we've actually started a whole section where we're introducing specialists as the gurus of business, because that's what they are. So today, we have three gurus here who are specializing in corporate governance, which is quite brilliant. David is going to be our facilitator. Now, David is David White from DRG, and he's quite a unique individual because he spends more time trying to help other people's businesses than he does his own. And sometimes I have to pull him straight and say, listen, David, what do you actually do? But that's the way he is. So, David, the floor is yours. I'll speak to you later.
Awesome. Grant, thank you so much. And to all our guests here today that have joined us for the masterclass on governance, very warm welcome. This next hour together is really exciting for us, and we hope it's going to be the same for everyone.
Morning, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me. I feel privileged to be called a guru. Not sure whether that's the case, but anyway, we'll leave it at that. It's wonderful to share a panel discussion with you and Clifford. Really happy to be here. So when David approached me and he said, let's do a masterclass on governance, I thought, oh, that's brilliant. Let's do that. So I pinned down a few thoughts, and I'd like to share my reflections with you based on my years in practice and what I've studied and what I am studying. And it would be wonderful if we could do it as interactive as possible. So please, if you want to interject, if you want to ask a question, please do so. You could do it on the chat. You can open up your camera. You can ask it in person. Whatever works for you will work for us. And let's have a conversation. Let's have a debate and a good discussion around this. So obviously, when you think about corporate governance in the South African space, your go-to source would be the King Code. I don't think that there would be many South African business people who are not familiar or at least know about the King Code. And I'm not going to go through the principles and the practices and so on of King, but I would like to rather speak about concepts and key things which I think are important in this space. Thanks, Russell, no problem. So let's start with a definition. It's always good to understand what the core concept is, and then we can take it from there. So when you read different people and thought leaders, they have different definitions of corporate governance. And I like the definition that the King 4 report has given. It talks about effective and efficient leadership by the governing body in order for the company to achieve 4 key outcomes. And those 4 key outcomes are ethical culture, good performance, effective control, and legitimacy. Now, we could talk for a whole hour just on those 4 outcomes, but I'm going to leave it at that, other than to say maybe one sentence about each one of those. Ethical culture is, I would think, the most important and the most difficult to achieve, because how do you feel it? How do you touch it? How do you translate it into a business model? It's really hard. But as we've seen, if you don't have an ethical culture, things tend to fall apart. And good performance is what everybody focuses on from an operational perspective, right? So it's well entrenched. It's understanding your financial statements. It's understanding what your KPIs are, your ratios, etc. And in order to get to good performance, you need effective controls. You know, it's like having children and not disciplining them and not teaching them how to behave. In Afrikaans, you would say, is a losgemors. You don't want that. You want things to be, in place, and that you understand what you are doing. And then we come to this really big concept of legitimacy. My word. Legitimacy is your name, your reputation, your standing, the level of respect that you have by all your stakeholders. And in many instances, people would refer to their social license to operate. If you lose the respect and the trust of your stakeholders, it will be very difficult to perform. Right, so David was talking about the tangibles and the intangibles, and I'd like to spend a little bit of time on that. Let's start with the tangibles because those are the easier ones. So tangible corporate governance refers to those aspects of corporate governance where you can see them. It would be your frameworks, your structures, your processes, the standards that you use, your governance hierarchy. So, for example, when you set up a company, and I'm familiar with the listed space, so you tend to go to where you know best, is you have your board, you've got your board committees, you've got your exco, you've got your opco, and then you've got your divisional management. So you can clearly see there's a very formal structure in place. It's like the skeleton of your business that drives performance and enables information flow and decision making. Another really good example is many instances companies follow ISO standards. So ISO 14,000 relates to environmental management, ISO 9,000 quality, etc. And these standards are international best practice, and it guides a company how to do certain things in a very disciplined and controlled manner. So you can see how it links back to your good performance and then your effective control. Another thing that helps a company a lot is understanding the space in which they operate and what do they want to achieve? What is their purpose? What are their strategic outcomes and their strategic objectives? And what are those external associations, international standards, frameworks, indices that they want to be part of and part of the community to improve their performance? I'm thinking of We Mean Business, and where you can make certain commitments towards societal impact and good business. I am thinking of other commitments where you make, for example, say you the Chamber of Mines, or any other association which is linked to your specific industry or sector. These associations typically have codes of good conduct, and they also provide guidelines. In some instances, these associations are quite strict, like the United Nations Global Compact. If you choose to become a member of the Compact, you then subscribe to their requirements, which then includes annual reporting, and you provide feedback to your performance of the 10 principles. This is a wonderful way. It's like Crib Notes for free. I don't know why people not use this and just grab at the opportunity, because then it gives you indications of what the things are that you can do to improve your business, not just from a financial perspective, but from a broader perspective. So we commonly refer to sustainability, sustainable development, or ESG. So you would look at your performance from a prosperity perspective, i.e. what's your economic and financial performance? Because let's be honest, if you don't make enough money to sustain yourself, your obligations, and your greater stakeholder network, well, then it's going to become really difficult, right? So you've got to be financially viable. Secondly, you look at your social environment, i.e. who are those people who influence your company, but equally so, who are those people that you influence and you impact? Are you aware who they are? Do you know what their needs and expectations and requirements are? And equally so, how they feel, but how you feel about them. And that's typically what we call your materiality assessment. Some companies like, I really like Coca-Cola's and Unilever and Nestle, have got fantastic materiality assessments. They're very mature, and you can immediately see one page. You can see what are the material issues, which, by the way, are not quite the same as a risk or an opportunity, similar but not the same. What are the material issues and drivers from the perspective of your stakeholder, and then also from the perspective of the company? And interestingly enough, you will see that they are not always aligned. And the idea behind stakeholder engagement would then be, to what extent is it possible to align these interests and expectations? And are these expectations reasonable? Because not all expectations are reasonable. And if you comply with the expectation of one stakeholder, you might be harming the interests of another stakeholder, or it might not be in the best interest of the company. So, it's always a dance. It's a tango. You've got to find that Goldilocks sweet spot where you can say, okay, I think this decision I'm taking with these actions will be in the best interest of the company and serve the greatest needs for the greatest amount of stakeholders. That's just one perspective. I mean, there are many things. Life's not perfect and we haven't figured it all out, but I find that that works fairly well. Okay, so these would be your tangible factors or elements that contribute to corporate governance. What I've also found in practice, and I have these conversations with my husband, and then I just sort of smile, is this could be your best friend, like your enabler and your driver of your strategic objectives, or it could be a bureaucratic nightmare. If you implement your structures so rigidly, and if you do not apply your mind, and if you do not follow substance over form, and it becomes a rule-based exercise, nobody wins, because it restricts so much that people do not feel comfortable enough to be innovative, and you're not allowed to fail. And we all know the best way in which you learn and in which you grow is by failure. But let's do it fast, and let's try and make new mistakes and not repeat the same mistakes we do. Sometimes it doesn't happen. You need 2 or 3 times, but then you get it. But this is a wonderful way in which you can make corporate governance your own. A good example of this could be, for example, where you implement in parallel to your formal structures, which you need to have a board committees, exco, opco, etc. Those are good things. But also you could consider something more fluid, something more organic, like a community of practice. It works beautifully. So this is where you have self-organization, people come together, and the rules of the game are totally different to the formal, traditional corporate environment. That is, for example, where you have self-organizing. People come together and they say, you know what, we care deeply about a certain thing. It could be unemployment. It could be social upliftment. It could be poverty or climate change or water insecurity. It doesn't matter what it is, but generally it is something very close to the company and within your local environment. And if a company then permits the employees and the greater society the freedom to develop this and to make their own rules and to determine the flexibility or adaptability of this community of practice, then you can drive innovation. You can find better ways of improving decision-making and problem-solving, and it can benefit the company. So those are some thoughts on the tangible aspects of corporate governance. Then I move to intangible corporate governance, and that would be your ethics and your culture. It's like, this is how we do things around here. It's like the vibe. You know, when you walk into a building, you can just feel a vibe. Have you noticed that? I mean, it's the most amazing thing ever, right? That's the culture of a company. And you could have different cultures within different operational divisions, within different functions and so on. But overall, a company has got a culture. And we all know this. I'm sure most of you know this much better than I do. It comes from the top. So leadership sets the tone. And the question you would want to ask yourself is, what kind of culture, what kind of activities, what kind of decisions do we actively promote through our decisions, through walking the walk, talking the talk? What do we condone? What do we look away? What should we be talking about which we are not talking about? And this is such a critical aspect. So many people are spending their lives trying to figure out how to improve leadership, how to improve the culture. We all know what happens to a toxic culture. In fact, I've got an example of what happened at Rio Tinto. It was in the news. Recently, Rio Tinto commissioned a survey because they found instances of bullying, racism, sexual harassment, gender-based violence, and all the rest of it. And their report was released the other day. I've got the name. It was the Australian Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Elizabeth Roderick, and it took something like 8 months to complete. And she released this report. It was scathing. It was just like, whew, you know, when I just read the highlights, but it takes your breath away. And they made 26 recommendations. So what the CEO did, Jacob Stausholm, I was quite impressed with this guy. I mean, generally speaking, when you receive a report which is so scathing against your company, you would like not decide to publish it and decide whether you're going to agree with the recommendations or not. He to the employees, and he committed to implement all 26 recommendations. And they immediately took charge, and he said, my primary focus will be to address these recommendations. I will do everything in my power to create a safe space, to avoid racism and bullying, to improve diversity and equality and gender and all of these things, and whistleblowing. I mean, let's just take a minute and think about this. How many leaders do you know who publicly put their hand up and say, mea culpa, I am sorry, unreservedly. I am sorry, and I will do everything in my power to fix this. He's not talking about production. He's not talking about tons. He's not talking about anything. He's talking about the people and the culture and how to fix it. So for me, that was quite an inspiring story. Also, what triggered a lot of deep emotions with me was during this whole COVID pandemic, you know, the way companies reacted. It was very sad for me to see some companies. The first thing they did was they said, well, we're going to stop paying our people. And on the other side of the spectrum, you had companies saying, let's reach out. Those people who have lost their jobs, those people who have economic failure or their lives and their livelihoods. So many amazing instances of people coming together, reaching out, preparing food packets, paying their people. I have a friend in the hotel industry. He did not work for more than a year. He received his salary for the whole year. I mean, that's inspiring, right? These are the things that you want to see happening. And that, for me, is the heart of governance. Governance is all about leadership, right? Ethical and effective leadership. And the ethical bit talks to the intangibles, and the effective bit talks to the tangibles. So can you see how beautifully this was thought out? I mean, the King Commission really knew what they were talking about, and how they understand between substance and form and principles versus rules, etc. Then I want to talk about knowledge and information. So in my life, I am quite keen on studying, and I have this FOMO of missing out and not knowing enough about stuff. But you know what? If you want to take a good decision, you need to know, right? Good decisions are always based on solid information. But it's not just enough to have data which translates into information. That information needs to translate into knowledge. And knowledge needs to be translated into actionable knowledge. And that's why I'm really happy to be part of this, because it's sad when you've got something to share and you're not sharing it. And I'm hoping that you will benefit from this and that it will translate into actionable knowledge from your side. So it's about understanding what your information flows are in your company. And can you see how it links back to your tangibles, your structures? Do you have structures that enable or hinder transformation flow in your company? How is it set up? Do you have a culture that enables information flow? Or do you have a culture where you're not allowed to communicate with people more senior? You've got to communicate with your manager and then your manager. You know, these are things that we don't always think about, but it's got such a huge impact in real life. Do you embrace relationship building? Do you open up the ability of people to talk to one another, or are you very restrictive? And if you don't have solid information and if you don't have solid knowledge, how will you take good decisions? And I mean, a company is all about the decisions you take that translates into action, that leads to your outcomes, your outputs, your services, and your products, which will have an impact on the greatest society or community. Then the last thing that I want to talk about is conversations, and it's closely related to information and knowledge. I recently realized how important storytelling, narratives, choosing the right words, and the conversations we engage in are. Are you actively thinking about the conversations you are having, both in a board meeting, a management meeting, with your colleagues, with your stakeholders? What are the conversations you are missing out on? What are the conversations you should be joining? And quite frankly, what are the conversations you should be exiting? Now, if you take it back to the heart of governance, i.e. effective and efficient leadership, it's the governing body's responsibility to drive the company and to set the direction. It's also the governing body's responsibility to make sure that management provides time-years complete, relevant information for the board to make a decision. And I mean, that's one of the key responsibilities of the company secretary. It's your job to make sure you've got a proper agenda with a board pack, with your committee packs, and it addresses the material issues, the risks, opportunities, all of those good things of a company. However, you can't just abdicate and say, well, it's management's responsibility and that company secretary hasn't done a job. You, as a board member, have a responsibility to make sure that you know enough about enough. And you need to read, and you need to engage, and you need to have these conversations. Do you understand the industry and the sector your company is in? That's your job, whether you're exec or non-exec. And Clifford can talk to that in a minute. Are you also up to date, and are you sure that the things and the issues that you are discussing at your board member are at the right level? Are you talking about strategic issues, or are you held back in operational or tactical matters? The board's responsibility is strategic. Exco is tactical and strategic, and then your opco would be operational. And you need to be clear as to where you are. There's nothing more frustrating than sitting in a meeting and you're discussing the wrong stuff. And you're like, my word, I'm wasting my time. That's horrible. And that is the board's responsibility. So make sure that you are aware of the conversations. And then thinking about the macro environment. So you've got the micro, your company, the meso, your region, and then the macro would be South African, national, and then global instances. And that also ties in quite nicely with your risk and opportunity. I'm thinking of the Ukraine war at the moment. It's very sensitive. My heart goes out to those people. How many companies had that on their risk register? How many companies had the COVID-19 pandemic on their risk register? Talk about a systemic risk. You know, I was reading today impact on the corporate space because of the war in the Ukraine. Just to give you an indication, I wrote it down. 10 companies wrote off $30 billion, American dollars, in 3 days. There are some companies contemplating exiting Russia forever I mean, these are serious decisions that you need to take. And you've got to think about it, and you've got to understand, and you've got to have the information, and also do a proper risk assessment, and not just risk from an isolated perspective, but integrated. And that's quite a difficult thing to do. You know, many times you would see a risk register and then it's singular risks. But what about the interactions of these risks to one another? And then you call it a cluster of risks. And I mean, that just puts a different spin on the ball altogether. So mindful of the time, David, these are the things that I thought of just opening up the conversation. I mean, I would love to hear what you think and what Clifford thinks. We haven't even spoken about compliance and the sources of governance, which I think Clifford is so well placed to talk to us about. And then we can have a discussion with our audience as well. Thank you.
Cathie, thank you, and it's just been incredible as we anticipated. So thank you so much. And I think you're quite right. I think it does lead on to compliance. And Clifford, may we please ask you to share your experiences and to respond in a bit more detail to the points that Cathie has raised.
Thank you, David. Thank you, and good day to everyone online watching this webinar. I'm just going to touch on a few things. I think Cathie covered most critical aspects of governance and the role of the governing body. I would just want to touch on a few things that, not that I'm changing what Cathie, but just to emphasize some of the things I thought I would touch on when I get a chance. The ethical culture, I think, for me, every time I join the board, that's my starting point to look at what is the intention? Why am I joining this board? What is it really that I want to achieve? And the main thing that you need to look at is the intention of the founders of the organization or the shareholders. What are their intentions? Why are they in business? And look at their founding documents, look at their policies, and based as a member of the governing body, look at how best you can support the interest of the company with those sources of information. I believe as a board member, if one goes into participating in any board, there are certain aspects that you need to look at from the word go. Your intention of being in that board, what your background is, what can you contribute? And you also need to understand the participants in the board, because I very much believe that the board need to be a representative of a variety of competences which the company requires. And you need to make sure that there's a balance between different players in the organization, especially on your board, so that there aren't gaps in the information that is circulating within the company. The ethical culture for me is actually informing everything that the board or that the governing body needs to do. Without that element in your intention or in your culture, the body is unlikely to succeed. I always say that one, as Cathie was saying, that there's a need of knowledge when you go and play in the governing body or you go and participate in the governing body. There's always a need for knowledge. And for me, is for anyone that wants to participate in the governing body or in the management of the organization, you need to understand where to get that information. I think for governance purposes, I think the King Code is the main source where you can go. and look at what is the thinking, what are the principles, what do they guide us to behave and to do in order to make sure that the outcomes of the operation and the leadership are what is expected from the organization. But I always say, I'm not sure, I might not probably, that might not be probably the main sources of information for others, members in the governing body or even in management. For me, I always look at the intention of the shareholder, which is mainly sourced from the memorandum of incorporation. That's where they define the intention. That's where they are tested whether what they want to do is not in conflict with it's not in conflict with the community they operate in. It's not in conflict with the ethics of the country or the environment that they work in. The second source of information for me is the guiding legislation. When you design your policies in the organization, you always look at what is the legislation that supports this industry or that support this organization. Those might be complex and probably not the way that the governing body would like it to be. But it's a founding. If you are in conflict with that law, you are in trouble. You need rather to plan and negotiate to change it, other than to do something that's contrary to it, because that will put the company at risk. So I'm not really to expand a lot on these issues. I think most of the key aspects Cathie has covered. I just wanted to add those few points in addition to what Cathie has shared with us. I'm not sure whether, David, that covers. If there are questions, I'm willing to take questions on my experiences and perhaps other contributions that I could make. Thank you.
Clifford, thank you so much. That was just awesome, and really shows your depth of understanding of governance in the workplace. Thank you very much. I do have a question, Clifford, which I'd like to direct back to you, and it's from KI Leadership, and it deals with values. And the question is, how can we work together to evolve organizations based on values? Basic human values. If you wouldn't mind sharing some thoughts on that.
I think for me, the first question is to understand what the leadership is doing. Because the leadership, as I think Cathie mentioned this earlier on about driving the culture of the organization, is the leadership. The leadership need to look at what are the issues that touch our employees directly, because they need to understand who are we employing in this organization. You cannot satisfy all needs of the employees, but you need to try and marry their values and their needs. You may not necessarily cover all of them, but a lot of times you might need to educate them on the direction that is best for the organization. So the value system of the organization, though it's led from the top, but it's a contribution from the bottom as well, from the source of performance of the organization, because those are the people that drives your organization. So you need to understand them. You need to help them if they are completely out of line with the values and culture, but you need to get from them as well what is best that they can share. I think from that, you may be able to build a very strong and concise and effective culture for the organization. I'm not sure whether I'm touching on all the key elements there.
I think you're doing it very well, Clifford. Cathie, would you like to comment further?
Yes, thank you. That was such a lovely question. I love that question. And it's something that I care about and think about a lot. If you go back to the United Nations SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, we've got those 17 amazing goals, which I think is international best practice on steroids. Is if you look at number 17, it's all about partnerships. And the one thing that the COVID pandemic has brought to the fore is there are really wicked problems out there and grand challenges, which are big. Unemployment in South Africa is huge. Poverty is, social incohesion. These are the big ticket items that we as a country need to face. Then you add macro environmental issues such as climate change, water scarcity. We're a water-stressed country. You've got tensions. You've got all of these things which just make it very complicated and complex within our society that we're operating in. The whole just transition to a low-carbon economy. I'm sure it has impacted every one of us already, and it will impact us further. So to ask the question, how do you use values? I think that's what it's all about in life, is if you understand what are the values close to you. So let's say it's respect or trust or value addition, and you could find like-minded people who are willing to set aside differences and collaborate. And it's very easy to collaborate without being anti-competitive. There are ways and means of doing it. You always have to respect your legislation, but collaboration and partnerships are the answer, because these problems are too big to solve. If you can then find a middle ground to say, I equally feel serious about this and that I want to make a contribution. I want to be part of the solution as opposed to aggravating the problem. Let's pull together, and instead of each company having different projects which have got limited impact, have one big project with huge impact that pulls everybody together. When you pull your resources, your skills, your knowledge, your money, your enthusiasm, your energy, amazing things happen. As opposed to everybody sitting in their little corner and trying to do something, and then it's like tepid water. Not cool. So I think that's a practical way of doing it. You start small. You start within your supply chain or your suppliers or your clients, and it can grow and it can actually get a life of its own. There are many wonderful collaborations and coalitions out there. Or you just join an existing one, or you start a new one. But it should be value-based.
No, I definitely agree. That's really amazing. What I've been hearing this morning is that I don't want to say governance is easy, because it clearly isn't. And it clearly takes courage, determination, perseverance. It takes some effort to put in place. But what I really like about governance is that it very much is a formula for success. It's a framework for organizations, for business leaders, for governing bodies to follow. And essentially what the codes, and in particular King 4 codes, talks about, to be successful in business, to be successful and sustainable, you really need to be an effective and ethical leader. And that's really that core aspect. And what King 4 does is it also breaks down, what does it mean to be an effective and ethical leader? And it tells you. And Cathie has taken us through those different points. But it's to create an engaged and ethical culture in the organization, to be productive, to be meeting internal objectives, to be meeting external stakeholder expectations, to have the right controls and oversight in place, and to be legitimate. So to be an effective leader, if we're meeting those 4 criteria, then we're able to say that we are meeting what is required for us to run a successful business. And then the codes go on and they say, gosh, we'll help you further. To help you meet those 4 outcomes, we are suggesting that 17 principles will help you to do that. And when you look at the 17 principles, they just best practice. They're just normal things. You need to have a strategy, a business plan in place. You need to have financial controls. You need to have all the aspects that you need to have in place to run a successful and sustainable business. So the codes aren't doing anything other than encouraging that leaders recognize that it is possible to create successful businesses by following certain principles which are designed to meet certain outcomes. What we are required to do as governing bodies is put practices in place. Those practices that we put in place need to help to support the principles, and the principles therefore follow through into meeting the outcomes. So it is a scientific process. And from our work with entrepreneurs and business leaders, helping to create more successful businesses, our first starting point is to say, yes, there's 17 principles that we need to look at from a governance perspective. And there's 17 sustainable development goals, which the United Nations put together and Cathie's referred to. Those are the 34 areas that we tend to focus on when we're meeting and talking to business leaders and entrepreneurs. So we like the framework, we like the science, and we see that it's a huge advantage for business leaders to follow in their pursuit and endeavors to create successful and sustainable businesses. Definitely. No, thanks, Cathie. I was about to hand back to you just to polish it for us, but that certainly is what gives us confidence in our ability to interact, engage with business leaders, and say, yes, it is possible. You can have a successful business, and a lot of amazing thought and detail has been put together by the King Code and the commission that was put together. One other aspect just to cover is to talk about integrated reporting. Integrated reporting is so important. If we go back 100 years or maybe even not that long, what was really important was that businesses were profitable and shareholders made lots of money. So everything was really about the financials. And what we're finding today is the financials aren't enough to make sure we're creating a sustainable business. And we do need to look at what's referred to as other capitals. We need to look at the human elements. We need to look at nature, the social elements, manufactured goods, so that we're getting a more holistic perspective of the business. And once we do that, and we have a better idea of our starting point for moving the organization forward, it makes it so much easier. So there's so much good practical information coming out of governance, and certainly something that is not too difficult for people to get their heads around and to apply into their working days. So I'll leave it there. Thank you. Cathie, would you like to respond further?
Yeah, I love the way you were explaining it, David. It makes a lot of sense. And I think of one of the CEOs I served under in my previous life. He was a very unique and eccentric Italian. And he would always say to me, Cathie, keep your feet on the ground. There's no sense. I saw a comment, we tried to make it too complicated. And I agree. Corporate governance is common sense. You don't need a degree to work it out. If you read it, you're like, but of course. And you want to get to the stage where you go, but of course, this is what we're supposed to do. If you look at it, having my ex-company secretary hat on, be pragmatic. I believe that if you can find the middle ground, not too warm, not too cold, not too extreme, not too left, not too right, just a happy medium. We are not ever going to be perfect. And it took me many years to realize 100% is not going to happen. I'm happy if I don't get 100%, but I give it my all. I really work hard and I try to get there. But, just relax, keep your feet on the ground and be pragmatic. Does it work in your circumstances? And I'm thinking of the practices that you were referring to. The principles are but of course statements. There's nothing more to discuss or to, is it true or is it not true? These are fundamental truths. But the practices might not always work in your circumstances. So just sit back, have a cup of tea, think about this. Does it work? Does it not work? But always keep your purpose in mind. What is it that you want to achieve? What is the positive impact that you want to leave? What's the legacy that you want to leave in the broader environment? Don't tell me it's to sell stuff. That's not inspiring. What is it that you want to achieve that inspires people? What are the big problems that you want to contribute solving? For me, that's the purpose of a company, right? Mm. And you reverse engineer, and then you come to the realization, okay, if, for example, my purpose in life is to eliminate malaria, that's a grand challenge of note. I mean, that's a fantastic purpose. Then you pull it back and you realize, what are the things that I need to enable me to get there? What works, what doesn't work? And then you say, okay, what are the actions I need to take? In order to take these actions, what are the things or the inputs I need? I need skills, I need expertise, I need governance structures that work well, I need a strategy that pulls everything together, I need robust risk and opportunity governance, I need metrics and targets. And if you then pull it back and to become a little bit technical, the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, is my second favorite of all. It's first the SDGs and then the TCFD with the 4 pillars. And the methodology is so elegant. I use it for everything in my life, whether I cook and I don't really cook, or when I do anything else. It talks about what is your governance, what is your strategy, what is your risk management, and what are the metrics and targets. So a metric would be your unit of measure. How do you measure it? Is it absolute or intensity based? And then your target is, what do I want to achieve by when and how do I want to do it? And it's so fundamental. If you structure your business around those 4 things, keep your feet on the ground, you have a blast, you have some fun, and you are pragmatic, I think you'll get there. That's what I wanted to say.
No, awesome, man. Cathie, thank you so much. Clifford, I see there's a question that's come directly to you, and it talks about how do we bridge the hierarchy disposition? In other words, how are we able to disseminate information from the board right through the organization? Sorry, it is a tough one.
Yeah, but an interesting one, because I think in every organization, you would find that communication is one of the key challenges. There isn't an organization where I've been where communication is not one of the key challenges. The issue is how, the question that I think is how do you bridge that gap between different levels and different silos in the organization? I think it goes back to perhaps what I mentioned. I think Cathie mentioned that as well, that the intention or the purpose of what you are trying to achieve. Because once everyone has got a common vision, has got a common purpose, the tendency is to be able to put the processes and systems that accelerate the flow of information, not only from the top to the bottom, but from the bottom to the top as well. Recently, organizations are flattening their structures. And the reason for most of that is merely to achieve that communication flow, vertical communication flow. I don't think there's any magical wand here that you can say, if you use this, you would get the perfect information flow. I think it starts from the top, how quickly and how effective they want to communicate. And from there, they are able to reach out to all levels who might be filters, because every level, if there are filters, the bottom of the organization will find that they get a wrong message, not the one that comes from the top. So if the intention of every level is to make sure that what is communicated is a common message throughout the organization, I think a much effective communication process will take place. But I don't think we can achieve the purpose, the perfect situation at all, because every level you go in the communication process, you find little or big filters.
Yeah, thank you, Clifford. I think you've answered that really well. You know, the common message. And I think to some degree, it also comes from a common language which is created. You know, the leaders of the organization have a responsibility to help the organization understand where we're going, what are our measurements, what are our responsibilities to stakeholders, what are our internal hurdle rates. So, you know, all of that information needs to become very clear across the whole organization, so that common messages become so much easier to communicate. So thank you for that, Clifford. Cathie, I have two somewhat complicated questions for you too, but I know these are right up your street, and they from Tracy Moram. And Tracy asks two questions. What are some of the challenges in business implementing good governance? And the second question, can economic, financial, social inclusion and good governance at the societal level be solutions for the global economic future?
Great questions. Okay. Let me start with the first one. Just give me the first one again before I go. I had a thought and then I lost it again. Sorry. The first one?
No problem. What are some of the challenges in business implementing good governance?
Okay, perfect. So having been a company secretary, that was primarily one of my functions. And I think if you understand where the company wants to go and build relationships, that for me is the key to any kind of success, is be deliberate and be specific about the relationships that you have. You need to have a good and mutually respectful relationship. I mean, you're never going to be best friends, and you're supposed to have an arm's length relationship in any event, but you have to get to know that person. So your key relationships would be with your board chairman, your CEO, your colleagues, the exco, the managers, and it's wide because it's vertical and horizontal, and understand where they are coming from. So high levels of empathy are required. You cannot assume just because you think in a certain way, other people think in that way. Invariably, it's not the case. So suspend your judgment. Hold your ego at the door. Try and understand what they are saying. Listen more than you talk, and get to the crux of their challenge. You know, you often work with many functions. So you will have internal audit, doing an audit in operations, and then there's a clash, which you can understand because people are coming from a different perspective. If you create safe spaces where people can have a decent conversation, and you promote a culture of not being rude. I mean, if you can just manage not being rude, we've all seen those emails, and then everybody's copied. Don't do that. Just don't go there. You know, just be a proper person. Think whether that person would appreciate it or not, and get to the crux. Invariably, go to that person's office or pick up the phone if it's not possible, and don't send the email. And try and understand where that person is coming from. That's a very practical way in which you can diffuse a situation And again, that blockage which prevents people from taking a decision and for the business to operate can flow. Your job is to unblock the hurdles and the challenges, and that's good governance. Is the information flowing? Are people understanding? Do we have a mutual understanding of the problem? How do we improve our decision making? And importantly, how do you take the decision from a concept to implementation, to monitoring, and to measuring? And these are all part of governance. So there are easy ways of doing it. Instead of having a 5-hour exco meeting, short and sharp and sweet. Instead of having 50 pages of minutes like I used to do, short and sharp and sweet. Get to the point, take out the emotions, take out the nastiness, and focus on the problem. I find that that has worked in practice. And when you have a challenge with a specific person, and despite best efforts, you cannot resolve it, well, then go a level up and try and diffuse it that way. The second one, yes, that's one of my favorite questions. Is it possible to have an integrated approach? So that's what I'm spending my time and nervous energy on to a large extent. It's trying to understand how can a business perform equally well from a prosperity point of view, a social point, and environmental or ecological, underpinned by governance. Governance is the glue that keeps everything together. And my worldview or my conspiracy theory is the purpose of a company is not to make profit. In fact, the purpose of a company for me is how do you contribute to being part of the solution of a big problem, and the money will flow. So I've had many conversations in my life where people just go, don't know what you're talking about. That's fine. Everybody's entitled to their decision, and that's great. But if you think about it, companies are here to serve communities and society. That's what they do. How do you serve society, being part of the solution and not aggravating the problem? So the British Academy, that's their definition of purpose of a company, and I love it. Your purpose should be addressing big problems without contributing to the problem, whilst in the process making sufficient money that you are financially stable. There's nothing wrong with money. My mom always says there's nothing like money putting color in your cheeks. I love it, right? But the question is, how do you make your money and what do you spend it on? There needs to be a balance. So I hope that answered the question.
I think it answered it very well. Thank you so much, Cathie. Grant, just before we hand back to you, Clifford, would you like to just give us one last mouthful of good advice and information before we close off today? You're off there, Clifford. Clifford?
You're on mute, Clifford.
So you need to. There we go.
No, sorry, David. No, I was saying that a lot of stuff has been said. Just probably one point that I want to mention is that governance is not just for the governing body; it's for every employee in the organization. So whatever the governing body is doing, it needs to filter down throughout the organization. I think that's one important point that I just want to set at the end. Otherwise, thank you very much for letting me participate in this.
Thank you, Clifford, and thank you, Cathie. I think today has been really amazing. To all our guests today, we hope you've enjoyed today's session. Please get in touch with us directly. If you have more questions or more thoughts or ideas, we'd love to hear from them. And Grant, to the Top Business team, thank you so much for putting this together, and back to you.
Yeah, I think it was an incredible session. So well done to everybody, Cathie, David, Clifford. I mean, I've learned so much, and I started taking notes so that I could close off and wrap it up. But every time I thought I was wrapping it up, Cathie or Clifford would come back and say, "Well, you're not quite finished, mate. You see, we've got a lot more to tell you." So it's one of those things that just evolves. The more you talk about it, the more it evolves. You're talking about the need to achieve ethical culture, good performance, effective controls, legitimacy, big one. How do you do this? The need for strong leadership, which is huge, huge, huge. Strong leadership. communications with stakeholders. I mean, these just goes on and on. Knowledge of the dynamics around you. Legitimacy, big one. Rules, we need rules, and we need to abide by them. So what do we want to achieve? That was the outcome. What do we actually want to do? What do we want to do most? And that sort of came out as well, is it important to you? What are you achieving? And Cathie said it, you want to have fun. At the end of the day, just listen to the way it was summed up. It was so incredible. So I'm just going to sum it up like it and say thank you very much, panel. Really, really incredible session. For the people at home who've watched it, I'm sure you've got as much out of it as I have. This is being currently streamed on YouTube and Facebook. And what I suggest you on Facebook, like it and do what you have to do and follow us. On YouTube, just press the subscribe button, and then you'll have a push button when we're coming up again and have another incredible session. So once again, thank you very much, panelists. Cathie, Clifford, David, brilliant. And this is Grant Adlam signing off from KZN Top Business Masterclass. So once again, thank you very much.
Thanks, Grant.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Cathie. Thank you, Clifford.
It was great.
Thanks, Cathie. Thanks,
Thank
Dave.
you.